In the freezing winter of 1939, one of the most unlikely wars in history began. A small country with limited resources stood face to face with one of the most powerful armies in the world. On paper, the outcome seemed obvious. It wasn't. So how did Finland manage to resist the Soviet Union? Why did this war even begin? And how did a conflict that was expected to end quickly turn into a struggle that surprised the entire world? To understand the Winter War, we need to go back to the 10th days just before World War II fully expanded. In 1939, Europe was already on edge. Germany had invaded Poland, and the global situation was becoming more unstable by the day. The Soviet Union, watching these developments closely, began to think about its own security. Leningrad, one of its most important cities, was located close to the Finnish border. From the Soviet perspective, this was a risk. Leaders in Moscow wanted to push the border further away from the city to create a buffer zone. They approached Finland with demands: territory in exchange for land elsewhere. The proposal was presented as a security arrangement, but Finland sighed differently. For a country that had only gained independence a couple of decades earlier, giving up territory was not a small decision. It raised concerns about sovereignty and future pressure. Negotiations took place, but no agreement was reached. And then the situation escalated. In November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland. The expectation was clear: a quick victory. The Soviet military was massive compared to Finland's forces. It had more troops, more tanks, more aircraft. From a purely numerical perspective, the difference was overwhelming. But numbers don't always decide wars. Finland had something else: preparation, knowledge of terrain, and a strategy built around survival rather than dominance. The Finnish army knew its environment better than anyone. Dense forest, frozen lakes, and extreme cold became part of their defense. Instead of facing the Soviet forces in large open battles, they used mobility and flexibility. One of the most important tactics used by Finland was the guerrilla-style warfare. Small units moved quickly through forests, launching surprise attacks and then disappearing. Supply lines were targeted, communication routes were disrupted. Instead of fighting the full strength of the Soviet army at once, Finnish forces broke it into smaller, more manageable parts. And then there was the weather. Temperatures dropped to extreme levels. For soldiers not prepared for such conditions, the cold became as dangerous as the enemy. Finnish troops were equipped for winter. They used skis to move across snow quickly. They wore clothing suited for the climate. Soviet troops, in many cases, were less prepared for these conditions, especially in the early stages of the war. This created a serious disadvantage. One of the most well-known examples of Finnish tactics was the motti strategy. Instead of attacking large formations directly, Finnish forces would isolate sections of the enemy, cutting them off from supplies and reinforcements. These isolated groups were then surrounded and gradually defeated. This approach turned the size of the Soviet army into a weakness. Large units moving through narrow forest roads became vulnerable. Once separated, they lost coordination and effectiveness. For the Soviet Union, the early phase of the war did not go as planned. Progress was slow. Losses were higher than expected. The idea of a quick victory started to fade. International observers began to take notice. How was this small country holding out against such a powerful force? But the situation was not entirely one-sided. The Soviet Union began to adapt. It reorganized its forces, improved coordination, and increased pressure along key fronts. More resources were committed. Strategies were adjusted to deal with Finnish tactics. The fighting intensified. One of the central points of conflict was the Karelian Isthmus, a region that became the focus of major Soviet offensives. Here, Finland had built defensive lines, including fortifications designed to slow down advancing forces. For weeks, these defenses held, but constant pressure began to take its toll. The Soviet military, with its larger resources, continued pushing forward. Artillery bombardments increased. Reinforcements kept arriving. Gradually, the defensive lines started to weaken. Despite strong resistance, Finland was facing a difficult reality. Its resources were limited, its manpower was smaller, and while it had managed to hold off the initial advance, sustaining that resistance over time became harder. By early 1940, the situation was reaching a turning point. Soviet forces broke through key defensive positions. The pressure became overwhelming. Finland was still fighting, but the cost was rising rapidly. At this stage, negotiations began. In March 1940, the war came to an end with the signing of a peace treaty. Finland was forced to make concessions. It gave up parts of its territory, including areas that had been heavily contested during the war. These losses were significant, especially considering what Finland was trying to defend. But the outcome was not as simple as victory or defeat. The Soviet Union achieved its objective of pushing the border further from Leningrad, but the cost was far higher than expected. The war exposed weaknesses in its military, issues with coordination, leadership, and preparedness. For Finland, the situation was different. It lost territory, but it maintained its independence. This was critical. Against overwhelming odds, Finland had managed to avoid complete defeat. It had resisted long enough to force a negotiated end rather than total occupation. And this is why the Winter War is often remembered as an impossible fight, because based on size and strength alone, the outcomes seemed predictable, but the reality was far more complex. The war showed that strategy, environment, and determination can significantly influence outcomes. It also demonstrated that even a powerful military can struggle when faced with unexpected challenges. The global impact of the war was important too. Other countries were watching closely. The performance of the Soviet military raised questions about its effectiveness, which would later influence decisions during World War II. At the same time, Finland's resistance gained international attention and respect. Looking back, the Winter War is not just about territory or military outcomes. It's about how a smaller force adapted to survive against the larger one. It's about how conditions like terrain and weather can shape the course of a conflict. And it's about how expectations in war can be completely overturned. Because what was supposed to be a quick and decisive operation turned into a long, costly struggle. A war where the stronger side did not achieve an easy victory, and the weaker side proved that survival itself can be a form of success.